Table of contents. This reference runs from the definition and legal basis of a framework agreement, through the full procurement and call-off procedure, to over 20 common misconceptions. Warnings, tips, frequently asked questions, and a closing quick reference summary. Next slide. Definition and legal basis. What a framework agreement is, and the two legal sources that govern it. Next slide. What a framework agreement actually is. A framework agreement is a procurement strategy, not a separate mode of procurement like competitive bidding or negotiated procurement. It lets a procuring entity make advance arrangements for what it will need in the future, without committing to purchase anything until the actual need arises. Its purpose is to expand the pool of prospective bidders, take advantage of economies of scale, minimize the administrative burden of running separate procurement activities for the same recurring need, and generate time and money savings. In practice, this is the kind of detail that is easy to overlook. Next slide. Legal basis, Section 16 of the Act. Framework agreement. To procuring entities may use a framework agreement as a procurement strategy to expand the pool of prospective bidders, take advantage of economies of scale, minimize the administrative burden of conducting separate procurement activities, and generate time and money savings. The framework agreement shall be in the nature of an option contract between the procuring entity and the bidder that stipulates the terms and conditions to be applied in subsequent contracts for the procurement of goods, infrastructure projects, and consulting services with a single or multiple contractor, manufacturer, supplier, distributor, consultant, and service provider, subject to the guidelines to be issued by the GPPB. This is the exact rule to keep in mind when reviewing this stage of the process. Next slide. Legal basis, the policy statement, Circular No. 07-2026. 1. Public procurement shall, in all cases, be governed by the principle of proportionality, among others. This ensures that the conditions and parameters in the development of requirements, choice of procurement modality and implementation of contracts shall be reasonably proportional to the needs of the procuring entity, and the nature of the contract or project to be procured. 1. 2. Towards this end, Section 16 of Republic Act, I. No. 12,009, and its implementing rules and regulations, IRR, provide for the use of a framework agreement as a procurement strategy to expand the pool of prospective bidders, take advantage of economies of scale, minimize the administrative burden of conducting separate procurement activities, and generate time and money savings. This provision sets a clear, specific standard, not just a general guideline. Next slide. Legal basis, purpose of the guidelines. These guidelines shall govern the use of a framework agreement as a strategy for the procurement of goods, infrastructure projects, and consulting services, as provided in Section 16 of RA No. 12,009 and its IRR. This detail is worth remembering, since it is the specific basis for how this requirement is actually applied. Next slide. About the guidelines themselves. GPPB Resolution No. 12-2026, approved on the 23rd of July 2026, fills a gap that existed since the IRR of RA No. 12,009 first took effect. Section 16.2 always left the detailed operational mechanics of framework agreement to separate guidelines the GPPB was authorized to issue. This resolution is that guideline, Circular No. 07-2026, attached to the resolution as Annex A. It replaces reliance on the bare text of Section 16 alone with a complete, operational framework covering everything from definitions to termination. This point is worth keeping in mind for future reference. Next slide. Definition of terms. 7 terms that anchor the entire guidelines. Read closely, since several are frequently confused. Next slide. Call-off and framework agreement. A. Call-off. The purchase order issued by the procuring entity to exercise its option under an existing framework agreement after the best offer is determined, requiring the supplier, contractor or service provider to deliver the goods or perform the works or services, in accordance with the terms and conditions stipulated in the said framework agreement. B. Framework agreement. A procurement strategy that may be undertaken by a procuring entity whereby advance arrangements on what it will be procuring in the future are determined. The framework agreement shall be in the nature of an option contract between the procuring entity and the bidder that stipulates the terms and conditions governing future procurement contracts. For multi-year framework agreements, a second-stage bidding process shall be conducted through a mini-competition among the pool of qualified bidders to determine the winning bidder for a specific call-off. This is often the deciding factor in whether a related transaction is considered compliant. Next slide. Framework Agreement List and MYCA. C. Framework Agreement List. The detailed list and technical specifications of goods to be provided, the scope of works for infrastructure projects or the scope of services in the case of consulting services. D. Multi-Year Contractual Authority, MYCA. The authority issued to the procuring entity to procure multi-year projects, in accordance with the form and conditions set forth in Section 9 of RA No. 12,009 and its IRR. Keep this rule in mind, since it directly affects how this stage of the process actually works. Next slide. Mini-competition and option consideration. E. Mini-competition. The second stage in a framework agreement where qualified bidders in an existing framework agreement are requested to submit their best price proposal to determine which among them has the best offer. F. Option consideration. The amount paid by the procuring entity to the qualified bidder as consideration for the option granted in the framework agreement. This is a key requirement that should be applied exactly as written, not merely in general spirit. Next slide. Qualified bidder. G. Qualified bidder. A bidder in a procurement project subject to a framework agreement which has been determined by the Bids and Awards Committee as technically and financially eligible and to which the procuring entity shall enter into a framework agreement with. This wording matters, since even a small deviation from it can change the outcome. Next slide. Why qualified bidder is a new, deliberate term. This term was introduced specifically in the 2026 refinement of the guidelines to ensure consistent reference throughout the document to bidders that have cleared eligibility and technical, financial screening under a framework agreement procurement. A qualified bidder is not automatically the winner, it is simply a bidder confirmed capable of entering into the framework agreement. Who actually wins a given call-off is determined separately, through outright ranking, single year, or mini-competition, multi-year with multiple qualified bidders. This is a useful checkpoint to apply consistently. Next slide. Scope and application. Who this applies to, which modes it can be paired with, and when it is genuinely the right tool. Next slide. Coverage. 4. 1. These guidelines shall apply to procuring entities of all branches and instrumentalities of the national government, its departments, bureaus, offices and agencies, including state universities and colleges, SUCs, government-owned or controlled corporations, GOCCs, government financial institutions, GFI, and local government units, LGUs. 4. 2. The use of framework agreement applies to all types of procurement, whether goods, infrastructure projects, and consulting services. This is the kind of provision worth having on hand for quick reference. Next slide. The modes framework agreement may be paired with. In order to ensure an open and transparent process, attract a broader pool of bidders to drive competitive pricing, diverse market ideas and innovative solutions, and ultimately achieve value for money, framework agreement requires the use of either competitive bidding or limited source bidding as a mode of procurement, as may be applicable. However, procurement projects below the threshold amount of PHP 2,000,000 pesos for competitive bidding may still use framework agreement as long as it follows the procedure for competitive bidding. This is the exact rule to keep in mind when reviewing this stage of the process. Next slide. A deliberate narrowing from the original draft. The 2026 refinement specifically limited framework agreement to competitive bidding and limited source bidding, removing competitive dialogue, unsolicited offer with bid matching, and small value procurement. The GPPB's own reasoning was that the objective and procedure of those other modes simply do not align with how a framework agreement is meant to operate. This detail often makes the difference between a smooth process and one that runs into trouble. Next slide. Why framework agreement exists, the full rationale. The use of framework agreement as a procurement strategy is anchored on time and cost savings generated through the reduction of administrative burden and cost of repetitive bidding. Moreover, procuring entities can leverage economies of scale through bulk buying or consolidating procurement requirements in one bidding, which likewise avoids splitting of contract. Of greater significance to public procurement is the ability of a framework agreement to ensure supply security and supply chain flexibility, as well as mitigate compliance risks which often hound procuring entities even with proper planning given the shifting market dynamics and heterogeneous bidder capacity. This provision sets a clear, specific standard, not just a general guideline. Next slide. When framework agreement is best suited. Accordingly, framework agreement is best suited for the procurement of goods, infrastructure projects or consulting services that are a. frequently, routinely or repeatedly used, b. used for an indefinite period or quantity, c. needed over a long or set period but the exact quantity, timing or scope of work or scope of service is unpredictable, d. by its nature, use or characteristics, the need arises on an urgent basis, e. needed for disaster preparedness and response, or f. other analogous or similar circumstances. This detail is worth remembering, since it is the specific basis for how this requirement is actually applied. Next slide. General conditions. The option contract nature of the agreement, its fixed period, and what the framework agreement list must contain. Next slide. An option contract, not a guarantee to purchase. 5. 1. A framework agreement may be undertaken by a procuring entity by setting up advance arrangements on what it will be procuring in the future and outlining the technical specifications. Scope of works, terms of reference, quantity or volume, cost or pricing. Delivery requirements or performance conditions and such other terms and conditions over a set period governing future procurement. 5. 2. The framework agreement does not guarantee procurement but creates the structure for future procurement as needed through a mini-competition or call-offs. Hence, it shall be in the nature of an option contract between the procuring entity, as the offeree and the qualified bidder, as the offerer covering the right to buy any of the items in the framework agreement list within a specified period. This is often the deciding factor in whether a related transaction is considered compliant. Next slide. The fixed period. The framework agreement shall have a fixed period of either 1, 2, or 3 years within which the procuring entity may exercise its option. Keep this rule in mind, since it directly affects how this stage of the process actually works. Next slide. The framework agreement list, required contents. The framework agreement list shall indicate the items or scope of work or service covered by the framework agreement. In particular, it shall include the following: a. type and nature of each item, scope of work or service to be procured, b. technical specifications, terms of reference or scope of work, as may be applicable, c. maximum quantity for each item, scope of work or service, d. estimated cost per item, scope of work or service, e. total approved budget for the contract, approved budget for the contract, including budgetary allocation per item or scope of work or service, f. estimated delivery period or completion schedule after receipt of a call-off or from any date determined by the procuring entity, g. annual estimate or programming for a multi-year framework agreement, and h. other appropriate information as may be necessary. This is a key requirement that should be applied exactly as written, not merely in general spirit. Next slide. Additional rules governing the list. In determining the items to include, the end-user or implementing unit must consider requirements that will benefit from a pre-arranged procurement structure. But where actual procurements are done on a needs basis, section 5.5. For items, works, or services delivered or performed in multiple locations, the procuring entity must indicate them separately in the framework agreement list, reflecting the appropriate estimated cost for each location, section 5.6. The maximum quantity indicated must reflect what the end-user or implementing unit may actually need during the covered period, taking into account current inventory and past procurement utilization data, section 5.7. The framework agreement list must also indicate the annual estimate or programming used for budgeting purposes, Section 5.9. This is the kind of item worth double-checking before moving forward. Next slide. When the list and the bidding documents disagree. In case of conflicts between the information provided in the framework agreement list and the bidding documents, the former shall prevail. This wording matters, since even a small deviation from it can change the outcome. Next slide. Procurement planning and execution. From the decision to use a framework agreement through to signing it, the longest, most detailed section of the guidelines. Next slide. An optional, dedicated BAC. The head of the procuring entity, head of the procuring entity. In consideration of procurement efficiency as well as the volume and complexity of procurement projects under a framework agreement, may establish a separate BAC for this purpose. This is the kind of provision worth having on hand for quick reference. Next slide. Assessing whether framework agreement is the right choice. The end user or implementing unit shall assess if the adoption of a framework agreement is more practical, economical, and advantageous for the government, taking into consideration the following: A. Improved procurement efficiency through the minimization of repetitive conduct of procurement or occasions of failed biddings. B. Extent to which stockholding or warehousing requirement, including the associated costs and risks, may be significantly reduced or avoided. C. Competitive pricing owing to mini-competition. D. Optimization of the approved budget for the contract through call-offs made at the time of actual need. E. Advantage of a lean and just-in-time procurements. And F. Reduction of additional costs arising from procurement delay. This is the exact rule to keep in mind when reviewing this stage of the process. Next slide. Validating feasibility through market scoping. To validate the feasibility of using a framework agreement, the end user or implementing unit shall ensure that in the conduct of market scoping under Section 10 of the IRR of RA number 12,009, there are prospective bidders that are willing and capable of providing the goods, infrastructure projects or consulting services, as the case may be. B. The estimated prices per unit or scope that constitutes the approved budget for the contract is competitive over the set period of framework agreement. C. The proposed terms and conditions in the implementation of the framework agreement are reasonable or consistent or aligned with prevailing market conditions or industry practices. And D. The quantity, volume, scope of work, scope of service, as well as the period of the framework agreement, are supported by the existing supply chain network. This provision sets a clear, specific standard, not just a general guideline. Next slide. App linkage and early procurement activities. 6. 4. No procurement shall be undertaken unless it is in accordance with the approved indicative or final annual procurement plan, APP, of the procuring entity, as the case may be. The procuring entity, in the preparation of its app, shall include procurement projects that will be covered by a framework agreement and attach the corresponding framework agreement list. 6. 5. Early procurement activities, EPA, may likewise be undertaken for procurement projects subject to framework agreement provided that no award or call-offs may be made until the effectivity of the budget and subject to the guidelines on the conduct of EPA. This detail is worth remembering, since it is the specific basis for how this requirement is actually applied. Next slide. Why AMYCA is not required. In the case of a multi-year framework agreement, as the same is merely an option contract and the acceptance by the procuring entity of the qualified bidder's offer does not create a procurement contract but merely establishes a structure for future procurements as the need arises. AMYCA is not required prior to entering into such agreement. The procuring entity shall nonetheless ensure that the budget necessary for its annual programming for the year is included in its approved budget. Hence, the amount of annual estimate or programming shall be the basis of the approved budget for the contract for each year that shall be indicated in the app. This is often the deciding factor in whether a related transaction is considered compliant. Next slide. The first year approved budget for the contract sets several downstream amounts. Section 6.6 continues, the approved budget for the contract for the first year, as indicated in the app and framework agreement list, is the basis for determining the required amount of the bidding documents fee, bid security, single largest completed contract, net financial contracting capacity, and protest fee. This was a specific clarification the GPPB board added during deliberation. Precisely because a multi-year framework agreement's total value could otherwise be mistaken as the basis for these amounts. Applying this consistently helps avoid the most common points of confusion. Next slide. Conducting the bidding and disclosure in the invitation to bid. 6. 7. The procuring entity shall conduct procurement using either competitive bidding or limited source bidding, including procurement projects below the threshold amount of PHP 2,000,000 pesos for competitive bidding, but will be using framework agreement, in accordance with the relevant provisions herein and of RA number 12,009 and its IRR. 6. 8. The invitation to bid shall indicate that the procurement will be subject to a framework agreement pursuant to these guidelines and shall state whether framework agreement shall be for a single year or multi-year. Keep this rule in mind, since it directly affects how this stage of the process actually works. Next slide. Extending bid security until execution. It is the responsibility of the BAC Secretariat to ensure that the bid security is valid until such time as the execution of the framework agreement. For this purpose, the BAC Secretariat shall request the bidder to extend its bid security as may be necessary. Failure to extend the bid security shall disqualify the bidder from further participating in the framework agreement. This is a key requirement that should be applied exactly as written, not merely in general spirit. Next slide. Determination of qualified bidders, single-year agreements. Section 6.10, outright determination, and the cascade rule if the top bidder refuses. Next slide. Single-year, outright determination. If the framework agreement is for a duration of 1 year, the BAC shall check the eligibility and compliance of all the bidders with the technical and financial aspects of the project to determine all the qualified bidders and rank them accordingly. Thereafter, the BAC shall make an outright determination of the lowest calculated responsive bid, LCRB, most economically advantageous responsive bid, MEARB, most advantageous responsive bid, MARB, or highest rated responsive bid, HRRB. For instances falling under Section 65 of the IRR, the BAC shall make an outright determination of the single calculated responsive bid, SCRB, single rated responsive bid, SRRB, single economically advantageous responsive bid, SEARB, or single advantageous responsive bid, SARB. This wording matters, since even a small deviation from it can change the outcome. Next slide. Single year, the notice to execute. The BAC shall then recommend to the head of the procuring entity the execution of a framework agreement with the LCRB, MEARB, MARB, HRRB, SCRB, SRRB, SEARB, SARB, as the case may be. Upon receipt of the BAC recommendation, the head of the procuring entity shall issue a notice to execute framework agreement to the said bidder. This notwithstanding, actual purchase by the procuring entity shall be made only upon issuance by the BAC of a call-off when the need to procure arises. This is the kind of provision worth having on hand for quick reference. Next slide. Single year, if the top bidder refuses a call-off. Should the determined LCRB, MEARB, MARB, HRRB refuse to accept the call-off, the BAC shall proceed to cancel the said declaration and determine the responsiveness of the bid of the second-ranked qualified bidder. Once determined as LCRB, MEARB, MARB, HRRB, the BAC shall recommend to the head of the procuring entity the execution of a framework agreement with said bidder. In case of refusal to accept the call-off, the framework agreement shall be automatically terminated and the procuring entity shall likewise enforce the performance securing declaration. Should the next LCRB, MEARB, MARB, HRRB refuse to enter into a framework agreement, the BAC shall repeat the process until the framework agreement is executed or declare a failure of bidding. This is the exact rule to keep in mind when reviewing this stage of the process. Next slide. The cascade rule exists specifically to avoid a failure of bidding. This is one of the specific improvements the 2026 refinement introduced. The earlier draft had no such mechanism. Now, a refusal by the top-ranked bidder does not immediately doom the entire procurement. The BAC works down the ranking, one bidder at a time, before ever declaring a failure of bidding. Each refusal along the way triggers automatic termination of that bidder's framework agreement and enforcement of its performance securing declaration, a real consequence, not a mere formality. In practice, this is the kind of detail that is easy to overlook. Next slide. Determination of qualified bidders, multi-year agreements. Section 6.10b, the mini-competition requirement, and what happens with only one qualified bidder. Next slide. Multi-year, initial screening. When the framework agreement is for a duration of 2 or 3 years, the bidders shall make an initial submission of their eligibility requirements and financial bid offer. Upon receipt of bid submissions, the BAC shall check the eligibility and compliance of bidders with the technical and financial aspects of the project to determine the qualified bidder, S. Thereafter, the BAC shall recommend to the head of the procuring entity the execution of a framework agreement among the qualified bidder, S. Upon receipt of the BAC recommendation, the head of the procuring entity shall issue a notice to execute framework agreement to all qualified bidder, S. This provision sets a clear, specific standard, not just a general guideline. Next slide. Multi-year, no winner without a mini-competition first. The BAC shall not make a determination of the LCRB, MEARB, MARB, HRRB, LCCRB until a mini-competition is conducted among the qualified bidders. The BAC shall issue a call for mini-competition by sending a request to all qualified bidders to submit their best financial proposal on a specified date, time and place to determine the bidder with the LCRB, MEARB, MARB, HRRB, as the case may be, and issue the corresponding call-off. Refusal of the bidder to participate in the mini-competition shall result in the automatic termination of the framework agreement as to the refusing bidder and shall be a ground to enforce the performance securing declaration. This detail is worth remembering, since it is the specific basis for how this requirement is actually applied. Next slide. Multi-year, when there is only one qualified bidder. However, in case there is only one qualified bidder, the BAC shall make a determination of SCRB, SRRB, SEARB, SARB and recommend to the head of the procuring entity the execution of a framework agreement with the said bidder. This notwithstanding, the BAC shall instruct the immediate republication of the bidding documents for at least one more round of procurement in order to invite additional bidders and expand the pool of qualified bidders on the basis of the same app as the original or earlier publication. Should the need to procure arise prior to the execution of another framework agreement, the BAC shall issue a call-off. In case another framework agreement has been issued to other qualified bidder S prior to the need to procure, a mini-competition among all qualified bidders shall be conducted following the above stated procedure. This is often the deciding factor in whether a related transaction is considered compliant. Next slide. Why the old automatic conversion approach was removed. Under the earlier draft, a multi-year framework agreement with only one qualified bidder would have automatically converted into a single-year agreement. The 2026 refinement replaced this with republication instead, giving the market another chance to produce competing bidders, while still letting the procuring entity issue call-offs to the sole qualified bidder in the meantime so that service delivery is not interrupted while republication is underway. This point is worth keeping in mind for future reference. Next slide. Continuing obligations after execution. Bidders executing a framework agreement, single-year or multi-year, must ensure the continuing validity of their eligibility documents throughout the implementation period, Section 6.11. The BAC reserves the right to review a bidder's qualifications at any stage of implementation, notwithstanding its earlier eligibility finding. If capability changes such that the bidder no longer meets eligibility criteria, the BAC shall revoke eligibility and disqualify it from any further award. After first informing the bidder of the reasons, Section 6.12. Within 5 calendar days of receiving the notice to execute a framework agreement, the bidder or its authorized representative must formally sign it. The procuring entity pays exactly 1 Philippine peso, 00 peso as the option consideration for the option granted, Section 6.13. The end-user or implementing unit must ensure periodic review of a multi-year framework agreement to address implementation concerns and ensure optimum performance, Section 6.14. This is a useful checkpoint to apply consistently. Next slide. The right to protest. Bidders may file a protest before the head of the procuring entity against any decision of the BAC within 7 calendar days from receipt of said decision and after the denial of its request for reconsideration. Subject to the provisions of Section 83.2 of the IRR of RA No. 12,009 and other associated issuances. Keep this rule in mind, since it directly affects how this stage of the process actually works. Next slide. The framework agreement itself. What it stipulates, and the strict rules that keep it from becoming a binding purchase obligation. Next slide. Still an option, never a commitment. 7. 1. Being in the nature of an option contract, the procuring entity may, within the period specified in the framework agreement, choose to either place an order for any of the item or scope of work or service in the framework agreement list or not purchase at all. 7. 2. Accordingly, a framework agreement shall in no case state or imply any agreement or undertaking by the procuring entity to place future contracts or orders with the supplier or service provider. This is a key requirement that should be applied exactly as written, not merely in general spirit. Next slide. The certificate of availability of funds is deferred. The issuance of the certificate of availability of funds, shall not be required prior to the execution of a framework agreement. It shall only be required for every call-off, subject to existing auditing and budgeting rules and regulations. This wording matters, since even a small deviation from it can change the outcome. Next slide. Required stipulations, option consideration, period, and perfection. A. The option consideration shall be set at 1 Philippine peso. 1 peso. B. A fixed period of either 1, 2, or 3 years within which the procuring entity may exercise its option, reckoned from the time the framework agreement was entered into and executed by the parties, and shall not be subject to any extension. C. The perfection of the actual procurement contract shall be reckoned from the date of execution of the call-offs. This is the kind of provision worth having on hand for quick reference. Next slide. Required stipulations, Section 71, Performance Security. D. Upon the execution of the call-offs, all rules and guidelines governing the implementation of procurement contracts under Section 71 of the RA No. 12,009 and its IRR shall be applicable. E. To guarantee the faithful performance by the supplier, contractor or service provider of its obligations under the framework agreement, the supplier or service provider shall submit a performance securing declaration prior to the signing of the framework agreement. It shall remain valid for the entire duration of the framework agreement as prescribed in the bidding documents or until the final acceptance of all items indicated under the framework agreement list. This is the exact rule to keep in mind when reviewing this stage of the process. Next slide. Required stipulations, warranty security and no modification. F. A warranty security shall be required for each call-off, in the form and amount stated in the bidding documents, and it shall remain valid for the duration of the applicable warranty period in accordance with Section 90 of RA No. 12,009 and its IRR. G. No modification of the provisions in the framework agreement shall be allowed during its validity. This provision sets a clear, specific standard, not just a general guideline. Next slide. What the performance securing declaration must state. The performance securing declaration shall state, among others, that the bidder, A, shall guarantee its faithful performance of the obligations under the framework agreement, and B, shall automatically be blacklisted from participating in any government procurement activity for 1 year, in case of first offence, or 2 years, if with a prior similar offence, in the event it violates any of the conditions stated in the framework agreement. This detail is worth remembering, since it is the specific basis for how this requirement is actually applied. Next slide. Prices are fixed, on what basis? Prices indicated in the framework agreement corresponding to the item, work or service in the framework agreement list shall be fixed. Prices shall be based on the following: A. Financial bid submitted by the bidder for single-year framework agreement and multi-year framework agreement with SCRB, SRRB, SEARB, SARB. B. Offered prices in the mini-competition for multi-year framework agreement. This is often the deciding factor in whether a related transaction is considered compliant. Next slide. How the cost per item was determined in the first place. The cost per item, work or service shall be determined and prepared after careful consideration of variables and factors that may affect future market prices. These variables and factors may include or use, whenever applicable, historical data, market study, feasibility study, net present value of money, foreign exchange rate, inflation rate, cost of money, assessment of total cost of ownership, and life cycle costing and value for money analysis. Prices quoted by the bidder must be within the total cost per item, work or service indicated in the framework agreement list. For this purpose, the financial bid submitted and best offer that exceed the total cost per item, work or service shall be automatically disqualified. Keep this rule in mind, since it directly affects how this stage of the process actually works. Next slide. Call off. The moment a framework agreement's potential becomes an actual purchase order. Next slide. When a call off may be issued. When the procuring entity has determined that an item, work or service covered in the framework agreement list is needed. It shall require the delivery or performance in such quantity as may be needed and at the price for which it was awarded by executing a call-off, as follows: A. For a single-year framework agreement and multi-year framework agreement with SCRB, SRRB, SEARB, SARB. The BAC may immediately issue a call-off upon determination that an item, work or service is needed. B. For multi-year framework agreement with multiple qualified bidders, the BAC may issue a call-off after the conduct of a mini-competition. This is a key requirement that should be applied exactly as written, not merely in general spirit. Next slide. Multiple destinations and the ceiling on repeated call-offs. The BAC is authorized to execute A. Call-offs requiring delivery to multiple destinations or performance at multiple locations as provided in the framework agreement list. B. As many call-offs for the same item, work or service as may be needed within the period of the framework agreement as long as the total quantity for all call-offs does not exceed the maximum quantity in the framework agreement list and the aggregate amount of all executed call-offs does not exceed the total contract price. However, in case there are still funds available from savings generated in the framework agreement as when the aggregate amount of the call-offs covering the maximum quantity is less than the approved budget for the contract, the BAC may execute further call-offs to the extent covered thereof. This wording matters, since even a small deviation from it can change the outcome. Next slide. Savings can be spent without starting a new procurement. This last sentence of Section 8.2 was a deliberate refinement. Previously, once the maximum quantity in the framework agreement list was reached, any remaining unspent approved budget for the contract would have required a brand new repeat order procurement to use. Now, the BAC may simply issue further call-offs against that leftover budget directly, without a separate procurement action, as long as the approved budget for the contract itself is not exceeded. This detail often makes the difference between a smooth process and one that runs into trouble. Next slide. Pricing of succeeding call-offs and the overall ceiling. 8. 3. The succeeding call-offs shall have the same unit price based on the financial bid submitted by the bidder in the case of a single-year framework agreement or multi-year framework agreement with SCRB, SRRB, SEARB, SARB. For a multi-year framework agreement with multiple qualified bidders, the price shall be determined through mini-competition but shall not exceed the price submitted by the bidder during the initial submission of the financial bid. 8. 4. In all cases, the maximum amount of call-offs within the year shall not exceed the approved budget for the contract as stated in the app and framework agreement list. 8. 5. The issuance of the certificate of availability of funds shall be required for every call-off, subject to existing auditing and budgeting rules and regulations. This is the kind of provision worth having on hand for quick reference. Next slide. Implementation and termination of framework agreements. Delivery obligations, the single largest completed contract aggregation rule, liquidated damages, and how the agreement ends. Next slide. Delivery obligations. After receipt by the supplier, contractor or service provider of the call-off, it shall deliver the items or perform the works or services within the period specified in the call-off. This is the exact rule to keep in mind when reviewing this stage of the process. Next slide. How call-offs are counted for single largest completed contract purposes. For purposes of determining the bidder's single largest completed contract when participating in other public bidding activities, the aggregate of the call-offs for a particular item, work or service shall be considered as one completed contract with the cumulative amount thereof as the total contract amount. In such case, the date appearing in the certificate of acceptance issued by the procuring entity for the last delivery will be considered as the date of completion of the contract. On the other hand, only those undelivered items, works or services in the call-offs shall be included in the statement of all ongoing government and private contracts for purposes of participating in other bidding activities. This provision sets a clear, specific standard, not just a general guideline. Next slide. Time extensions and liquidated damages. 9.3. Any request for an extension of time for delivery or performance shall be made in writing and prior to the date of delivery or performance indicated in the call-off. Such request shall be subject to prior approval by the procuring entity, after due consideration of reasonable cause. 9.4. If the supplier, contractor or service provider fails to deliver or perform within the specified period, inclusive of duly granted time extensions, if any, it shall be liable to the procuring entity for liquidated damages of at least equal to 1/10 of 0.001 of the cost of the unperformed portion of the total amount of the goods ordered or service to be rendered per call-off for every day of delay. This detail is worth remembering, since it is the specific basis for how this requirement is actually applied. Next slide. The 10% liquidated damages threshold. Once the cumulative amount of liquidated damages reaches 10% of the total amount of the items, work or service ordered per call-off, the procuring entity may terminate the framework agreement, without prejudice to other courses of action and remedies available under R number 12,009 and its IRR. This is often the deciding factor in whether a related transaction is considered compliant. Next slide. Automatic expiration, 3 conditions. Without prejudice to the provisions of applicable laws, rules, and guidelines, the framework agreement shall automatically expire under any of the following conditions. A. When the total maximum quantity and the approved budget for the contract as specified in the framework agreement has been exhausted. B. When the specified duration of the framework agreement has expired, or C. When the maximum quantity has not yet been exhausted but there is no longer any budget for the purpose or the budget is insufficient to continue with the implementation of the framework agreement. 9.7. All other rules governing contract implementation and termination under R number 12,009 and its IRR, and other relevant rules and regulations shall be applicable. Keep this rule in mind, since it directly affects how this stage of the process actually works. Next slide. Repertorial requirements, repeal, and effectivity. Next slide. Repertorial requirements. All procuring entities are required to indicate in their respective procurement monitoring reports, or in a reporting template that may be subsequently prescribed, all goods, infrastructure projects, and consulting services procured under framework agreement. This is a key requirement that should be applied exactly as written, not merely in general spirit. Next slide. Repealing clause and effectivity. 11.0 Repealing clause. All guidelines and issuances, or any part thereof, that are contrary or inconsistent with the provisions of these guidelines are hereby repealed, amended, or modified accordingly. 12.0 Effectivity. These guidelines shall take effect 15 days after publication in the Official Gazette or in a newspaper of general circulation. This wording matters, since even a small deviation from it can change the outcome. Next slide. The 6 prescribed forms attached to the circular. Annex A, Call-off Annex B, Framework Agreement Annex C, Framework Agreement List Annex D, Notice to Execute Framework Agreement Annex E, Call for Mini Competition Annex F. Performance Securing Declaration. This is the kind of item worth double-checking before moving forward. Next slide. Practical warnings. Points in the guidelines that are easy to apply incorrectly if read quickly. Next slide. The first year approved budget for the contract, not the total value, sets bid security and related amounts. For a multi-year framework agreement, it can be tempting to calculate bid security, single largest completed contract, NFCC, and protest fee against the full multi-year contract value. Section 6.6 is explicit that these are based on the first year approved budget for the contract specifically, as indicated in the app and framework agreement list. Using the total multi-year figure instead would overstate every one of these amounts. Applying this consistently helps avoid the most common points of confusion. Next slide. A call-off refusal has real consequences, not just a ranking change. When a qualified bidder refuses a call-off or declines to participate in a mini-competition, this is not a simple pass to the next bidder in line. It automatically terminates that specific bidder's framework agreement and is a ground to enforce its performance securing declaration, which can mean blacklisting for 1 year on a first offense, 2 years if there was a prior similar offense. In practice, this is the kind of detail that is easy to overlook. Next slide. The fixed period truly cannot be extended. Unlike many other timelines in Philippine procurement law that allow extension for meritorious cause, the 1, 2, or 3-year framework agreement period is expressly stated to not be subject to any extension at all. A procuring entity that needs more time must let the agreement expire and pursue a new procurement, not seek to extend the existing one. This point is worth keeping in mind for future reference. Next slide. The certificate of availability of funds still matters, just later. The certificate of availability of funds being unnecessary before signing a framework agreement does not mean funds availability stops mattering. It becomes required for every single call-off, subject to the ordinary auditing and budgeting rules already in place. The requirement is deferred, not removed. This is a useful checkpoint to apply consistently. Next slide. Practical tips. Ways to apply the guidelines correctly from the start. Next slide. Run the 6 suitability factors before committing to a framework agreement. Before choosing this strategy, check the actual need against Section 4.56 criteria. Is it frequently or routinely used? Needed for an indefinite period or quantity? Needed over a long period with unpredictable exact quantity or timing? Urgent by nature? Needed for disaster preparedness and response, or otherwise analogous? A need that fits none of these 6 is a signal that ordinary competitive bidding, without a framework agreement layered on top, may be the simpler and more appropriate choice. This detail often makes the difference between a smooth process and one that runs into trouble. Next slide. Disclose the framework agreement nature clearly in the invitation to bid. Section 6.8 requires the invitation to bid to state both that the procurement is subject to a framework agreement, and whether it is single-year or multi-year. Getting this disclosure right from the outset avoids confusion later about which determination procedure, outright ranking or mini-competition, actually applies. This is the kind of item worth double-checking before moving forward. Next slide. Keep the framework agreement list detailed and current. Since the framework agreement list prevails over the bidding documents in case of conflict, and since it is the reference point for maximum quantity, estimated cost, and delivery schedules, keeping it complete and internally consistent from the outset avoids disputes later about what was actually agreed to. Applying this consistently helps avoid the most common points of confusion. Next slide. Track the aggregate of call-offs against both the quantity and the approved budget for the contract ceiling. Because a framework agreement allows multiple call-offs over its lifetime, it is easy to lose track of the running total. 2 ceilings apply simultaneously, the maximum quantity in the framework agreement list, and the total approved budget for the contract, and both should be monitored together. Since reaching one without the other still affects what further call-offs remain available. In practice, this is the kind of detail that is easy to overlook. Next slide. Frequently asked questions. Next slide. Can a local government unit use a framework agreement? Yes. Section 4.1 of the guidelines expressly includes local government units among the procuring entities these guidelines apply to, alongside national government agencies, SUCs, GOCCs, and GFIs. This point is worth keeping in mind for future reference. Next slide. Does a framework agreement itself need a notice to proceed? The framework agreement itself does not trigger a notice to proceed, since it creates no procurement contract on its own. It is the call-off, once issued, that starts the actual delivery or performance obligation, with Section 71 implementation rules applying from that point, Section 7.4d. This is a useful checkpoint to apply consistently. Next slide. What happens if a supplier under a framework agreement is later found ineligible? The BAC may revoke the bidder's eligibility and disqualify it from any further award at any stage of implementation. After first informing the bidder of the specific reasons, Section 6.12, this is a standing, ongoing check, not a one-time determination made only at the start. This detail often makes the difference between a smooth process and one that runs into trouble. Next slide. Can a bidder challenge a BAC decision made during a framework agreement procurement? Yes. Bidders may file a protest before the head of the procuring entity within 7 calendar days of receiving the BAC's decision. After their request for reconsideration has been denied, following Section 83.2 of the IRR, Section 6.15. This is the kind of item worth double-checking before moving forward. Next slide. Is a warranty security the same thing as the performance securing declaration in a framework agreement? No. The performance securing declaration covers the bidder's faithful performance of the framework agreement as a whole, submitted once before signing. Warranty security is separate, required for each individual call-off, and tied to that call-off's own warranty period under Section 90, Section 7.4f. Applying this consistently helps avoid the most common points of confusion. Next slide. 25 common misconceptions. Corrected directly against the accurate text of Section 16 of the Act and GPPB Circular No. 07-2026. Next slide. On what a framework agreement actually is. A common misconception is this: framework agreement is a separate mode of procurement, like competitive bidding or negotiated procurement. The correct rule is as follows: it is a procurement strategy, not a modality. This distinction was specifically clarified in the 2026 refinement precisely because it is often confused and defined as a modality rather than simply as a contract. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On whether signing obligates a purchase. A common misconception is this: signing a framework agreement obligates the procuring entity to buy from that supplier. The correct rule is as follows: it does not. Being an option contract, the procuring entity may choose to place an order or not purchase at all, Section 7.1. And the agreement shall in no case state or imply any agreement or undertaking to place future orders, Section 7.2. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On the multi-year contractual authority. A common misconception is this: a multi-year contractual authority, MYCA, is required before entering into a multi-year framework agreement. The correct rule is as follows: it is not required. Section 6.6 states plainly that since the framework agreement is merely an option contract and creates no procurement contract until a call-off, a MYCA is not required prior to entering into it. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On which modes framework agreement compare with. A common misconception is this: framework agreement can be paired with any mode of procurement. The correct rule is as follows: it is limited to competitive bidding and limited source bidding, Section 4.3. Competitive dialogue, unsolicited offer with bid matching, and small value procurement were specifically removed in the 2026 refinement. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On the minimum project value. A common misconception is this: only large value procurements can use framework agreement. The correct rule is as follows: procurement projects below the 2 million Philippine pesos. 0 peso competitive bidding threshold may still use framework agreement, as long as the competitive bidding procedure is followed, Section 4.3. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On the certificate of availability of funds. A common misconception is this: a certificate of availability of funds, is required before signing the framework agreement. The correct rule is as follows: it is not required prior to execution of the framework agreement itself. It is required only for every call-off, Section 7.3. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On the option consideration amount. A common misconception is this: the option consideration paid to secure the option is a substantial amount, proportional to the contract value. The correct rule is as follows: it is fixed at exactly 1 Philippine peso. 1 peso, regardless of the size or value of the framework agreement, Section 7.4, Section 6.13. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On extending the framework agreement period. A common misconception is this: the 1, 2, or 3-year framework agreement period can be extended if the need continues. The correct rule is as follows: it cannot. Section 7.4b is explicit that the fixed period shall not be subject to any extension. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On bidding by lot, item, or package. A common misconception is this: bidders may bid by lot, item, or package under a framework agreement, the same as ordinary competitive bidding. The correct rule is as follows: this provision was specifically deleted in the 2026 refinement. Precisely because it was found administratively and operationally burdensome and could undermine the very benefits a framework agreement is meant to provide. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On the form of performance security. A common misconception is this: a performance security in the form of a surety bond or bank guarantee is required for a framework agreement, as with an ordinary contract. The correct rule is as follows: a performance securing declaration is specifically prescribed for all framework agreements, Section 7.4e. The GPPB deliberately standardized this across every framework agreement, rather than leaving the form open to the usual range of options. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On a refusal by the top-ranked bidder. A common misconception is this: if the top-ranked bidder refuses to accept a call-off in a single-year framework agreement, the entire bidding process fails. The correct rule is as follows: the BAC instead proceeds to the second-ranked qualified bidder, Section 6.10, 3, repeating the process down the ranking as needed. And only declares a failure of bidding if every ranked bidder in turn refuses. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On a multi-year agreement with only one qualified bidder. A common misconception is this: if a multi-year framework agreement ends up with only one qualified bidder, it automatically converts into a single-year agreement. The correct rule is as follows: it does not convert. Instead, the bidding documents are immediately republished for at least one more round to invite additional bidders. While call-offs may still be issued to the sole qualified bidder in the meantime, Section 6.10b(3). Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On exhausting the maximum quantity. A common misconception is this: once the maximum quantity in the framework agreement list is reached, the agreement must be terminated even if budget remains. The correct rule is as follows: the BAC may instead issue further call-offs to use any remaining savings, up to the approved budget for the contract, without needing a separate repeat order procurement, Section 8.2. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On pricing across multiple call-offs. A common misconception is this: every call-off under a multi-year framework agreement with multiple qualified bidders uses the same fixed price throughout. The correct rule is as follows: For that specific scenario, price is instead determined through a fresh mini competition for each call-off. Capped at, but not necessarily equal to, the price initially submitted, Section 8.3. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On prices adjusting with the market. A common misconception is this. Prices in a framework agreement can be adjusted over time to reflect market fluctuations. The correct rule is as follows. Prices indicated in the framework agreement are fixed, Section 7.6, based on the original financial bid or mini competition offer, not subject to later market-driven adjustment. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On how a multi-year winner is determined. A common misconception is this. For a multi-year framework agreement, the BAC determines the winning bidder immediately after checking eligibility. The same as a single-year agreement. The correct rule is as follows. For a multi-year agreement with multiple qualified bidders, the BAC shall not make the determination until a mini competition is first conducted among all qualified bidders, Section 6.10, b(2). Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On how call-offs count toward single largest completed contract. A common misconception is this. Each individual call-off under a framework agreement counts as its own separate completed contract for single largest completed contract purposes. The correct rule is as follows. The aggregate of all call-offs for a particular item, work, or service is instead treated as one completed contract, with the cumulative amount as the total contract amount, Section 9.2. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On whether eligibility, once confirmed, is permanent. A common misconception is this. A bidder's eligibility, once confirmed at the start of a framework agreement, remains locked in for its entire duration. The correct rule is as follows. The BAC reserves the right to review a bidder's qualifications at any stage of implementation, and may revoke eligibility and disqualify the bidder if its capability changes, Section 6.12. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On warranty securities coverage. A common misconception is this. Warranty security, like the performance securing declaration, is submitted once for the entire framework agreement. The correct rule is as follows. Warranty security is required separately for each call-off, Section 7.4f. Unlike the performance securing declaration, which covers the whole framework agreement's duration. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On modifying the agreement's terms. A common misconception is this. The terms of a framework agreement can be renegotiated or modified during its validity if both the procuring entity and the bidder agree. The correct rule is as follows. Section 7.4(g) is an absolute prohibition, not conditioned on mutual consent. No modification of the provisions in the framework agreement shall be allowed during its validity. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On the scope of framework agreement. A common misconception is this. Framework agreement is only meant for the procurement of goods, not infrastructure projects or consulting services. The correct rule is as follows. It applies to all three types of procurement, goods, infrastructure projects, and consulting services alike, Section 4.2. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On the liquidated damages rate. A common misconception is this. The liquidated damages rate for a delayed call-off is different from the rate used in ordinary government contracts. The correct rule is as follows. It is the same formula used throughout the IRR, 1/10 of 0.001 of the cost of the unperformed portion, per day of delay, Section 9.4. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On what happens at the end of the period. A common misconception is this. A framework agreement automatically renews if there is still budget or unused quantity remaining when its period ends. The correct rule is as follows. It automatically expires, not renews, under any of three conditions: quantity, approved budget for the contract exhausted, duration expired, or budget insufficient, Section 9.6. Renewal is not the default outcome under any of these. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On conflicts between the list and the bidding documents. A common misconception is this: the framework agreement list and the bidding documents will always say the same thing, so it does not matter which one is checked. The correct rule is as follows. The guidelines specifically anticipate conflicts between the two and resolve them by rule. The framework agreement list prevails over the bidding documents, Section 5.8. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. On whether a dedicated BAC is mandatory. A common misconception is this: a separate, dedicated BAC for framework agreement procurements is a mandatory requirement. The correct rule is as follows: it is discretionary. Section 6.1 uses may establish, vesting this as an option for the head of the procuring entity to exercise based on procurement efficiency, volume, and complexity. Not a mandatory structural requirement. Keeping this distinction clear helps prevent a recurring point of confusion in practice. Next slide. Quick reference summary. Next slide. Quick reference summary, 1 of 2. Legal basis, No. 12009, Section 16, GPPB Circular Number 072026, the 23rd of July 2026. Nature: a procurement strategy, an option contract, not a guaranteed purchase. Modes: it may pair with competitive bidding or limited source bidding only. Below threshold use, allowed below 2 million Philippine pesos if competitive bidding procedure is followed. Fixed period, 1, 2, or 3 years, never extendable. Option consideration, 1 Philippine peso. 001 peso, fixed in practice. This is the kind of detail that is easy to overlook. Next slide. Quick reference summary, 2 of 2. Certificate of availability of funds requirement, not required before signing, required for every call-off.